that we're engaged in is a course in healing, as you know. Sometimes in the courses that we're conducting this summer, we're dealing with healing by method of the structures of life, the social relationships in life, and so forth. That's fairly obvious. And sometimes we're talking about healing human beings in terms of their interior being. Now, behind the scenes of both of those is the same principle, and that is to say, the principle that people are healed in and through their social relationships today. There was a time not so long ago when, as you know, that was not true so much as it is now. If you looked at our time together as a stage play, and especially if you were the lighting director of the stage play, you would see that in recent days we have been turning the red and orange spotlight up on the group or on the polarity of the community in which human beings do not exist outside of some community, disclosed or undisclosed to themselves. That is what invents a human being, is a community. To put it in the way that an Englishman that we quoted in our publication Image on Youth Culture Today put it, you don't have any individual that is not invented out of a community. There is no such thing. If you run into a being in say, the jungles, a jungle boy who has been reared by the apes, Tarzan to the contrary, you discover a non-human being. A community, that is to say, you discover a human being without what we mean by a human being, with an elongated memory and with the possibility of making decisions. You run into, instead, a being that has been warped in that particular way. Then what you've got to see in our psychology and art course is that we've toned down the lights of red and orange on the community, and the stage has gone black for a moment. And now in psychology and art, the blue and green lights, if you will, have been brought up on the individual pole of being a human being. And in both these cases, the red and the orange and the blue and the green, there is no difference. That's what has to be kept in mind. You don't have an individual without a community, and you don't have a community without individuals making it up. Both of these dimensions of life require healing, and the interplay between the two, the community and the individual, or the accent on healing the individual or healing through the individual through the community or vice versa, both of these require healing whichever way you look. For without healing, there is no history. There is no such thing as human history, save healing takes place. The question is, of course, for us, who heals the healer? Who is going to assume responsibility for a comprehensive healing job? Who is going to be able to stand outside both of the sides of the polarity of individual and community, and be that reflective consciousness and active consciousness that changes by suggesting the new models that will enable the community or the individual to be healed? And this is what we're about. Maybe I can get into what I have to say this morning in and through the play Becket. This is the scene, you recall, where Becket and the king are hunting with their hawk. The king says, "Here comes the deluge. Do you like hunting this way with hawks?" Becket: "I don't much care to delegate my errands. I prefer to feel a wild boar on the end of my spear. When he turns and charges, there's a moment of delicious personal contact, when one feels at last responsible for oneself." The king: "It's odd, this craving for danger. Why are you all so hell-bent on risking your necks for the most futile reasons?" Becket: One has to gamble with one's life to feel alive. The king. Or dead, you make me laugh. And then he turns to his hawk. Quiet, my pretty, quiet. We'll take your hood off in a minute. You couldn't give much of a performance under all these trees. I'll tell you one creature that loves hawking anyway, and that's a hawk. It seems to me we've rubbed our backside sore with 3 hours of riding just to give them this royal pleasure. Beckett, my lord, these are Norman hawks. They belong to the master race. They have a right to it. The king. Do you love me, Beckett? Beckett. I'm your servant, my prince. The king. Did you love me when I made you chancellor? I wonder sometimes if you're capable of love. Do you love Gwendolen? Beckett. She is my mistress, my prince. The king. Why do you put labels on everything to justify your feelings? Beckett. Because without labels, my prince, the world would have no shape. King. Is it so important for the world to have a shape? Beckett. It's essential, my prince. Otherwise, we can't know what we're doing. Do you see this? We can't know what we're doing without labels. That is to say, without a model, we can't know at all what we're doing. Therefore, in this course, we're not after the details of psychology in some intensive degree in which you probe the idiosyncrasies and subtleties of the id or the superego or the ego or anything like that. And in the past, in our courses, we've had to, as you know, attack psychologism. We've been attacking psychologism because of the fanatical, morbid fascination that people have had in recent years with their own psychology, with what makes them tick. And we have seen the sickness that is engendered by the constant digging underneath. And in attacking psychologism, our intention, of course, has not been to attack the wisdom of psychology or the academic discipline of psychology, because we have to know that wisdom. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind at every point that psychologism is what is to be attacked and not the wisdom of psychology. That is where a person uses psychology in psychologism to escape his action, to escape the decision, to escape from being a human being, and where he becomes plagued with the disease of ever more deep introspection, and the more he feels comprehensively introspective, the more he feels he is well, and the more he is actually becoming ill in relationship to himself and in relationship to his neighbor. The reason we've got to be concerned, obviously, about the wisdom of psychology is that our job is to cast out demons, not the technical psychological demons that are there in the first instance that are discernible through the wisdom of psychology, but we've got to cast out the demons in the sense of the demons of the spirit. That's our job as the church. And that means that we use any 20th century wisdom there is available to cast out those demons. If it be psychological wisdom, we use it. If it be sociological wisdom, we use it. If it be philosophical wisdom, we use it. For we are the called people. We are the called ones who rise up to lead the other people and make use of the scientific data that's available to us. And the way that we cast out demons in the 20th century, to use Paul Tillich's phrase, is we call the demons by their right name. You cannot cast out a demon by calling it by its wrong name. It has to be called by its own name, and the only way that you get hold of a demon's own name is to move in to the situation in which that demon exists and discover its name. In other words, our job is to respond if you don't mind my going back to Tennessee Williams a few years ago when he did The Fugitive Kind. The movie was called The Fugitive Kind. I've forgotten the play at the moment. But you remember the scene, perhaps. Orpheus Descending, right. You remember the scene, perhaps, where the hero played by Marlon Brando and the heroine, I've forgotten who played that. Who? Joanne Woodward. Were in the graveyard. And as they sat on the tombstones in a graveyard, reflecting upon the vicissitudes of their particular life at the moment, Joanne Woodward, the heroine, says to Marlon Brando, "Can't you hear what these stones, meaning the tombstones, are saying to you?" Brando says, "No." She says, "They're saying, live, 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 live!" Do you get the point? Not just live, not just live, but live. Oh, my God, live. And, of course, this play comes out of that milieu and mood and tone in which human beings had discovered through such artists as Tennessee Williams exposing themselves to life. That time when we discovered and almost took a backtrack, almost, but not quite, took a backtrack on the demand to assume responsibility for your self-conscious presentness to being a human being. That's why we're studying psychology. To live, to live, to live is to get on top of your life. And you cannot get on top of your life outside of getting on top of the wisdom of the times. And in former ages, I'm sure this seemed, or seems as we look back on them, as a simple process. In the 20th century, it is not a simple process. It's highly complex. It's very, very difficult to know where you are. Now, in terms of our being the healers of the healers, if you will, I want to point first of all to where we're going. In the first place, the model is changing in terms of what it means to be a human being. And that model is changing. In the first instance, we're getting a new model of the mind in psychology. The new model of the mind is going to be based upon chemistry. That is to say, right now, we are discovering in our scientific experiments, in and through the hallucinogen drugs or LSD and so forth, we're discovering the way the brain operates physically. And therefore, in a very short time, we're going to have a new model of the brain that will take over the intuitive wisdom out of which former models of the mind have existed, which will be based upon the chemical dimension. That is to say, the relationship of the basic stuff in the cell of the RNA, the nucleic acids, I think they're called. And then in terms of the electronic, this is where we're going now. The new model of the brain, the new model of the mind is going to come out of utterly physical scientific experiments in relationship to the electronic. By that I mean the brainwave experiments that are going on today. And finally, I want to put up here as to where we're going for the new model of the mind today, Chardin-ism. I don't mean Teilhard Chardin. I mean the assumption of responsibility for the evolutionary process of the human mind. That's what I mean when I say Chardinism or Chardin, where you assume responsibility for creating the new model of the mind out of which you will develop the possibilities for discerning sickness and creating health, your own self, or as a community of persons. Now then, this new model means new things in terms of therapies. In the old therapies, based on the former models of the mind, the main one of which, and which can never be reduced, is what Freud was pointing to in terms of the id, the ego, and the superego. This is a mechanical model of the mind, as you can see, and it comes out of the Newtonian picture of the world in and through which Freud necessarily had to operate. The new model of the mind, whatever it may be, will not be a mechanical model at all. And this old model, though, is the model in which your therapy used words. That is to say, we all know the experience of someone saying something to us which encourages us, which discourages us. Or someone says a word to us that enables us to appropriate our own selfhood in a different way. In and through words was the method here. That will never, in my opinion, be diminished. We will always use words. This is a mechanical and intuitive and artistic image of the mind. This one that will come to be will not only use words, but it will add chemicals, electronics, and, if you will, some kind of willful assumption of responsibility for these demands or these other two dimensions in the new model of the mind that's coming to be. But words will always be there because the human being is that kind of entity which in its self-consciousness relies and must rely upon corporateness, which means to rely upon common sense, which means to rely upon words. So health that is coming is going to come both of these ways, chemically and electronically on the one hand, and words as we have intuitively worked up to this time in and through the breakthrough with Freud. You will know already, I'm sure, that the development in psychotherapy has moved down the road from the things that we have now come to caricature. The amazing and, if you will, amusing things that have happened is that up until now, every image has used, not necessarily words, but the Western is the words, then equivalent images of words. In Africa, a beat to get out your life in terms of a rhythm or a vitalism or whatnot, and so on. We could go through the other image. Zen Buddhism is, I think, probably the most amusing illustration because it is the perfect illustration that the psychologist's demand is to break parochialism in the individual and break him open to the more universal. In Zen Buddhism, to use one illustration only, you have the many, many tales where the master is teaching the student, and the master says something like, or the student comes to the master in the tale and he says something like, "Play me a tune on your stringless harp." And the master, without doing anything, says, "There, did you hear it?" And the student says, "No." And the master says, "Well, you should have asked me louder." Do you see how that expands human consciousness and raises up and calls into question, not in rationalistic terms as the Western mind would, but how it raises up my images are too small, my images are too small, they will not encompass comprehensively what's going on. The equivalent of this in terms of Western words or in terms of the Western image, of course, is that which is being satirized a great deal out on the West Coast these days by the new method of psychotherapy. I'm sure you've all heard of it, where the man is being interviewed about his new psychotherapeutic method. And he says, "Have you cured anybody?" the interviewer asked, and the doctor says, "Oh, yes," in a German accent. Of course, he has to have a German accent. He says, "I've cured many. In fact, 2. And he says, "Well, tell me about them. Oh, how did you cure them? What was the one? Give me an illustration." And he said, "Well, one of them was a woman, and she had this propensity. She was always cutting paper. She got scissors all the time and cut paper. She cut paper. She cut paper. Oh, day in and day out, she cut paper." "Oh," says the interviewer, "well, how did you cure her?" And the therapist says, "I said, don't cut paper." "Don't cut that paper. Don't cut that paper." He said, "Well, didn't that take you, didn't you have to Are you around her a lot in order to stop her every time? Say, don't cut paper? Oh, yes, he said, I lived with her. But you see the implications of this in terms of somebody coming to you. You're running your own show now. You're running your own psychotherapeutic techniques. You see the implications of this in terms of making a demand on consciousness. This is the key insight. It makes a demand on consciousness, period. We've had the Stone Age, or the primitive aspect of this, and such horrifying things as the shock treatment in medicine and so forth, in which the demand was made, but it was made so absolutely that it reduced the person to a vegetable and so forth. In that same school of psychotherapy, that caricatured in that same way, a guy walks in and he says, I'm a homosexual, to the doctor, you know. And the doctor says, I'm going to call the police. Right? You think of the mental health that can occur when a person is faced with you see the implications here, the corporate demand that society does not, in our current structures, allow this kind of thing to go on, and the demand which forces the person, in terms of calling the police, as a representative of society, to reflect upon the decisional aspect of his life rather than upon the victimism aspect that he is usually engaged in. This is what this kind of caricature that I've been saying demonstrates or reveals. The psychiatric period, I say, that we have been through is going to be looked back upon as the Stone Age of the new psychotherapy that will come to be. And so we're studying, really, in all of this, we're studying the history of psychological models, if you will. Now, I don't mean history in some past, archaic sense. I mean that Freud's model of the mind, in terms of the superego, ego, id, is an historical model. It is a currently vital model in that it still carries with it the power of enabling people to reflect on what it means to be a human being and what it means to be a human psyche. Freud was the breakthrough. And of course, as you know, he was the breakthrough in terms of the Victorian consciousness that had to be just brought down low or leveled by his guns, if you will allow Freudian imagery here, because it was... And the Victorian model of being a human being was an anachronistic model and did not enable people to live. In other words, man's desire for love, just to pick one aspect of it, had solidified and had crystallized in a certain form, the Victorian form, and this had to be brought low. And Freud was the 10-inch gun that was brought in by the civilizing process to blow this Victorian image to bits so that a new image could come to be. The joke on Playboy magazine today, of course, if you will allow me a side comment, is that Hugh Hefner's Playboy philosophy is just as anachronistic as the Victorian image itself, in that Hugh Hefner is fighting a battle that Freud won 100 years ago. The battle is over, and now you've got a guy like Hugh Hefner, you know, sitting there typing out endless Playboy philosophy in terms of sex to defeat Victorianism. I have not yet, to tell you the truth, run into one Victorian human being in my lifetime. Are you aware of that? Have you? Have you really? Now, you've run into people who have found it necessary to play pretend they were, but you haven't run into people who were Victorians in the Victorian sense whatsoever. Not whatsoever. Now, you could say that Hugh Hefner's attacking that pretense, and perhaps therein is the value. I don't know. Or if you want to push the further insight in this in terms of Ginsburg's recent conviction for pornography and the Supreme Court upholding his conviction, you'd have to say that his being condemned, he's being condemned by the fact that you and I have not done our job as the church, period. That is to say, we have not made a model available for human beings to live in terms of their sex life at all, but we've been on the job of all of the folderol we've been on instead of hammering out a new way to be a human being in terms of this dimension of life. Those are sideline introductory remarks. I haven't got started yet. The point is that we have a new model emerging, but we need clarity on the old model. You can't go around, making like you've got a new model emerging unless you know what's been going on in the old model. And as Joe Slicker was pointing out yesterday morning, you have, first of all, in the old model, the dealing of the human being, and I'll use Tillich's categories here, the dealing of the human being with fate and death. This is the id's insight, if you will allow that kind of peculiar terminology. Dealing with fate and death, this is the basic biological problem here. And then you have him dealing with the problem in terms of his being an individual and participating and so forth in life, with the dread of guilt and doom. And then finally you have the human being dealing with the dread of finitude and infinitude, to use philosophical categories, or existentially emptiness and loneliness and meaninglessness. Emptiness and meaninglessness are Tillich's terms here. Now, in this kind of a model, you do not say titch to old models. You simply see what they're pointing to in reality and how Freud's model enabled us to try to begin to come to terms with this. As Slicker suggested yesterday, any being that's a human being is a being that is an attempt to manifest itself. Or I have to be in existence. I have to manifest myself. I'm a thrust. And I'm in a world where I cannot manifest myself. That's the problem. That's the problem that psychology is dealing with, put in its highest abstract form, that I'm a thrust and the world is saying no. In this Freudian image here, what is being said no to is the thrust of the id to express my propensities, my biological propensities at base, which extend out into all of life and all of my experience. My propensities, this understanding here, or this model, says man is an animal who has these propensities, which the expression or repression of which determines his sickness or his health. That's all it says at its highest abstract form. Man is a being who has a propensity toward expressing these propensities, and to the extent that he expresses them or represses them, therein is to be defined his sickness or his health. That's what that model is saying. And then you have this amazing thing that I want to come back to in a moment, that all of this is superseded or overcome or overarched, I should say, by the spirit dimension of life. This I want to come back to. Up to here you have the psychological, a man experiencing the vicissitudes of life in the various dimensions, and then the question of the attitude he takes toward those. That's why this model is good. It points to realities. It points to the way life is in a mechanistic picture, to be sure. And that's the only reason that you would argue with it, is that it does have mechanistic implications, or it's based on a mechanical model. Now then, the question that we're raising today inside this whole context is to try to deal with the sociological pole. As you know, we've raised it up that there is the biological pole, that's this one over here, the sociological pole in psychology, and the rational pole in psychology. And we've spelled this out, and in and through yesterday's paper, I'm sure you're aware of this picture. Today we want to emphasize what's going on here in the social pole. The therapists and the psychologists who are here in our model are those who emphasize this aspect of life, that I show up in life wanting security, period. I want security. And I want it as much as I can get, and all of it that I can get, and so on. And on the other hand, other than security here, is the fact that the world I want security or acceptance, expressed usually in acceptance of my fellow beings. And the world says no, that it doesn't give one damn whether you're, that is to say, reality doesn't really care whether or not you're secure. That's the no in life that comes when you analyze life this way, or the psyche this way. And then the person has got to make his response to the fact that he wants security, and it's said no to, and that's the basis of what the therapists who fall under the category of the more socially oriented ones. You'll recognize them in terms of what they are trying to express. They sound sometimes very much like the image of India, or the image of the overlapping yin-yang, in that they're always after harmony. Harmony, harmony, harmony is the thing that you're after. That is to say, adjustment. And it's expressed in many different ways. You run into this in, I guess one of the more recent years, the last 15 years, expressions of it has been in natural childbirth, in which woman, in the problem of trying to decide what it means to be a human being, decided to latch on to the pole of being an animal, and so she gave up being a self-conscious. It said what you can do is you can just be this animal who can have a child without pain, and so forth. And you see, this is not to knock natural childbirth as a method of giving children. It's to knock the attitude that's behind it, or the reason this has come to be, in that it presupposes that being a human being is involved and ultimately wrapped up in security, in no pain. It's the equivalent, it's to put the pressure down on the pleasure principle of Freud, if you will. And no psychologist beyond Freud has ever lived without having to dialogue with Freud's insights, of course. And it's to put the pole down there. Spockism, in which it's assumed, and I don't mean Benjamin Spock. He has many great insights and helpful insights and so forth. But in this understanding of the psyche, it's assumed that what needs to be done is to bring about the most comfortable being that you can bring about. Well, the most comfortable being, to caricature it a bit, I suppose, on the face of this planet, is a squash. I look at a squash, and you can tell that a squash is just damned comfortable. There it is, you know. And so far as I know, a squash and a gourd are the least sensitive things that the Lord has brought into existence. I'm using a tale I once read by a story a woman once read in a fantasy, which maybe you recall it or know it. A squash, I say, or a gourd, is a very insensitive being. And this understanding of life in its perversion, I don't mean in its creative insights, this understanding of life in its perversion, or understanding of the psyche, said, the thing that life is all about is to avoid having conflict. Therefore, you were always working for acceptance. And every one of us in the room was reared in the perversion of this initial insight, or that is to say, in the reductionism of this insight, in which when some conflict arises in our groups, for example, around the table, why, everybody, you begin to sweat. Good Lord, there's conflict going on. Somebody's saying something that somebody doesn't like, and somebody else, and therefore they won't accept each other. And if they don't accept each other, then there's a big question mark, because you don't know what comes after that. Who knows? Because of course the insight never was pushed further than that. When I say this, this is the basic psychotic appropriation or malformed appropriation of a very creative insight. That is to say, human beings do, in fact, in their early stages on their journey from birth to death, need a certain amount of acceptance, and they need a certain amount of rejection. Period. That's the insight. They need this. And, in fact, that's what life does to them. And the problem is reducing life into the acceptance pole to the neglect of the fact that a no is said to human beings, and that no can be appropriated by human beings in a way that presumably other animals cannot do. I guess the height of this is in the caricature of the Rogerian method of psychotherapy that all of us have been familiar with, and if we are not familiar with it directly, we have been trained in it indirectly. And the Rogerian method goes something like this. Patient says, "Doctor, I just don't feel good." Doctor says, "Oh, you don't feel good." Patient says, "I have these feelings toward my wife." Doctor says, "Oh, you have these feelings toward your wife." Patient says, "Sometimes I think I hate her." Doctor says, "Oh, sometimes you think you hate her. Is that what you're saying?" "Yes," says the patient, "that's what I'm saying. Sometimes I think I have these bad attitudes." "Oh," says the doctor, "bad attitudes." "Right," says the patient. And on and on and on and on and on. Now, the positive insight behind this is, of course, that a human being is finally going to have to be responsible for himself. That's the positive insight behind the Rogerian method, that person is going to have to be responsible for his own life. The psychotherapy involved there is questionable on the basis, that is, it has been proved questionable, on the basis of whether or not this is a way to bring into consciousness the demand that is upon that human being by the indirect Rogerian method. And, of course, that's a caricature of it. It goes on with its positive implications beyond what I'm saying, of course. But it does not reach to the depths of being a human being because its basic understanding is this kind of reductionism in life. Now, you don't want to miss either the positive insight in any therapy that you study, nor do you want to miss its reductionism, that is to say, its perversion from the Christian or the all that is good point of view. In other words, it's based on the assumption of rational man, that if a person sees his problem, then he can do something about it. And as you will study in the paper this morning by Kieran Horney, one of the problems at the disappointments is that you get all of these insights out, and you help the patient kind of indirectly. You help him to get them into some kind of a gestalt, and then the patient thinks, well, now my problem's going to go away. And, of course, it does not go away. He remains the perverted being that he is, or inside his problem, because a man cannot change or penetrate his own illusion. This is if you want to attack it theologically, this is the problem with Rogerianism, is that it presumes that rationality enables a person to attack his own illusion. He is not able to attack his own illusion because he has put his rational powers into the service of preserving his illusion. That's why he cannot penetrate his own illusion. All of his rationality is geared that way, and all the methods of indirection will not alter that service. It has to come, then, from some kind of shake-up. If you looked at the various methods, you could classify them very quickly. In terms of the biological pole here, the method basically is to disclose to that person his inner conflicts, if you will, at the point of wanting to do things like sleep with his sister or his mother or something like that, and never having resolved those in his at the ego level, or the conflict of the superego making some kind of demand upon the person that he has never resolved at the ego level. If you look at the rational, to jump up here just for a moment, that we'll come back to in detail tomorrow, its method is basically confrontation in terms of the meaning of life, or the way that a person understands his life to be a meaningful entity going on in history. And then to come back to our level here, the method of therapy has been mostly involved with altering the person's relationships, and that means through the method of conversation I was caricaturing, through a democratic process, so to say. And the problem is, of course, that even at the best, say it did work, and he discovered with the wonderful accepting psychotherapist that he was, accepted by the psychotherapist. Then the problem is he walks out the door, closes it, and moves into a world that still says, to hell with you. I don't give a damn whether it's secure or not. That's the problem, you see. As soon as he walks out the door, he is faced with the no all over again and has no new way of handling that no in his life. This basically is what's going on in terms of the sociological dimension. And this, you could, Horney is a great illustration here that we're going to study this morning, who has analyzed man on the basis of acceptance and rejection, his security being threatened, and in the early years of his life, especially in relationship to the parents, develops what she calls neurotic trends that are repressed into the unconscious using Freudian methodology there. And in repressing them, has later in life to come to terms with the fact that he or she has repressed these and getting them up to consciousness. She is her own best critic, as you will discover in the paper. Her own best critic inside her reduced context, from my point of view. Then you have such persons as Sullivan, who has been here, and I guess the key one is Jung, the intimate colleague of Freud, who, while maintaining Freud's basic model of the mind, moved out and began to work in terms of the collective unconscious, what he called the collective unconscious, or the fact that human beings unconsciously appropriate basic archetypal images. Here he was dealing with something like the image, I suppose. And in these basic archetypal images is the place where where the therapist can discover sickness or health and so forth. Now, I want to spend just a moment in talking about these three dimensions, the biological, the sociological, and the rational, in terms of their very practical application, in terms of the renewal of the church. You'll remember that that our problem is the problem of living in a time when man has had two basic metaphors for his ethical action, as we've said in our courses, either in the Freedom Lecture of RS1 or in the Bonhoeffer paper, in which he talks about good as what is responsible. Man has had the metaphor of good and evil, the teleological metaphor for deciding what he's going to do, and right and wrong, the legal metaphor for deciding what he's going to do, and the 20th century, because both of these metaphors were based upon some kind of absolute or irreducible principle, absolute eternal principle, that was just assumed under a canopy where you could have eternal principles. When that canopy of Western civilization collapsed, man has had to bring into being the new metaphor of responsibility and irresponsibility. In terms of all of these three, you can see that the metaphor of good and evil arises out of what we've been calling the biological thrust. I'm going to come back to that in terms of the Freudian picture in just a moment, the Freudian analysis here. You can see that the legal metaphor for man's action has come out of his relationship of individualization and participation. That is to say, my actions in terms of approbation or disapprobation by the community, which gives you your other directed man, to use Priestman, and this, of course, on the biological pole, the good and evil, gives you your inner directed man, and so on. And in terms of the rational, the responsible and irresponsible, that is, the person who must assume responsibility for creating his own response out of a model, a comprehensive model in the present moment. These two metaphors of good and evil, right and wrong, coming out of those two dimensions of humanness, have been very useful up to the present time and will continue, I say, for all time to be useful metaphors, because they come out of the being a human being and the propensities that all of these two have seen. They will be useful metaphors, but they will not be comprehensive enough to enable the 20th century and the 25th century person to operate as a human being. Now the new metaphor here, and that means tomorrow morning we have to take up the rational psychologist. You can see this in Freud's model of the mind in terms of the superego, the ego, and the id. The id is that which yielded man his basic primordial image that there is a good and evil, in terms of I do not eat sand because it gives me a stomachache and so forth. In terms of the ego, you can see how it was this pole that gave man his right and wrong in terms of having to decide between what he would do in relationship to his id, and then the development of the superego, in which man has now, this would be the area where the categories of responsibility and irresponsibility in behavior would become clear. As I said at first, Freud's mechanical model is soon to be replaced, but in the meantime, you and I have to know what that model is saying in order to be helpful to other people. A shift is always seen when a model is changing, when the model that was there yesterday becomes a game or an excuse for inaction. And this is what now Freud's model, as you see, we're in a transition period, has become. Today, people laugh about whether or not you are anal or phallic or genital or one category or another, or they use in their sickness this model to excuse themselves for any kind of significant involvement with life, rather than, as it was in the beginning, a tremendous guide for living, tremendous insight into what it means to be a human being. I say you can tell when a model is shifting is that it becomes this kind of game or excuse. For example, Freud's insights in the beginning were taken very seriously because they opened us up. Those of you who remember the motion picture King's Row some 20 years ago, or that have read the story, will recall the story of the tremendous impact that it made upon society for a little town to have disclosed to it that there were unconscious motives at work in a doctor that sawed off the legs of one of the chief characters in the play, and that he didn't really have to have his legs sawed off, if you remember King's Row. I say at first we took these insights very, very seriously, and they helped us live, and now we joke about them. Or you take in terms of the social psychologists who have emphasized the ego pole there. You remember when Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, came out. Why, that was serious, and it sold millions and millions and millions of copies because it was taken as a new key insight into life. And then, of course, now, when somebody says how to win friends and influence people, they mean it cynically and jokingly and so forth. It's become a game. Or you take the word togetherness, which now we ridicule quite a bit in terms of psychological togetherness. We see the momism and all the other images that go along with that have now had to be said no to. Finally, I want to indicate the shift in this model in terms of two plays. Let us go back some 20 years to the play The Iceman Cometh. You remember The Iceman Cometh. And in that play, the basic theme was that people build illusions or bubbles to live in order to avoid reality. The closing implication of the play, implication, as all R implies, is an implication. The closing implication of The Iceman Cometh in relationship to illusions is, if we get rid of our illusions, then we will live. Now, 20 years later, we have the play, now motion picture, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, in which the two major characters, the man and his wife, who are at war with each other in the play, have in their lifetime, in their married life, had an imaginary child who has grown up, as you know, and in the third act of the play, the man, the husband, makes out like, in their imaginary context that they had been doing for many, many years, that the child, now grown up and a soldier in battle, has been killed in the war. That is to say, the man deliberately shatters the illusion that they have been operating in. The implication at the end of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is, so what? That does not make one iota of difference. That is to say, that what we're coming upon ourselves now as doing in the category of illusion is seeing that life does not get better in terms of the psychological dimension of life. That having illusions or not having illusions at the realm of the psyche, it is, of course, strategically better not to have his illusions, but what man is now seeing is that the self-conscious appropriation of his own illusion-making faculty is the key to humanness and not the psyche alone, however helpful the psyche or information into the psyche may be. In other words, today, as opposed to yesterday, the psyche is not just something that's there that you go and investigate, a la the mechanical model of superego, ego, id, or any other model. It's not there. There is no such entity as the psyche, but rather the psyche is that which is always and ever to be created by man himself. And this is where the new deliverance from the powers is going to come today. How do you create your own psyche and assume responsibility for it? In California, just a few weeks ago, I had dinner with a woman whose husband had been an alcoholic and who had recently died. And in the course of our conversation, I discovered that she was still in what you would call psychological grief. And I said to her, have you not found a way as yet to celebrate the death of your loved husband? And this attacked her in such a way that she broke down in tears in the first instance. And the next day she called me on the phone and said she had scurried to the dictionary to find some new meaning for the word celebrate. I said, there is no new meaning for the word celebrate. It just means celebrate. This is to distinguish, if you will, between being the victim of your psychological mechanism and being the person who decides to create his own psyche. It is in the Christian faith, of course, that the basic insight to being that which creates its own psyche is to be found. Therefore, when we get down to the art section in our course, we will be raising up the question of art, not in some where it just happens, but we'll be raising the question of art in terms of how do you deliberately get those art pieces into your being that create the psyche that you've decided you want created in you. In other words, I guess I'm saying the battle is still between, in psychology, still between the analytical and the intuitive, those who emphasize the analytical and those who emphasize the intuitive dimensions of life. But today and tomorrow, we will soon have more wisdom about what we mean by both of those terms, the analytical and what you mean by intuitive. In Milton's Paradise Lost, there's the phrase that sums up everything for me at this point in history in terms of psychology. Sums it up poetically, in which he says, the mind is its own place and can make heaven out of hell or hell out of heaven. This poet intuited years and years ago what now psychology is establishing systematically, that you and I are beings who have responsibility not just for life, but for the very way in which we use our psyches. And that's why when we get up in the morning and come over here to participate in worship, the question is not whether or not you feel like it, but what have you decided to do in terms of creating your own psyche? By what means do you intend to brainwash yourselves? The mind is its own place, and it can make heaven out of hell or hell out of heaven. We need to break.